it seems like we had kind of gone through, an elucidation of more like the practical aspects of the worldview that we were teasing out, particularly as it might apply to the climate crisis. And where we ended up was something revolving around, how do we get people together towards working through some global common good, past like various ways that we can disconnect from each other, from the rest of nature, and that seemed to introduce this twofold question of cultivating the necessary attunement to ride out these sort of cataclysmic changes in ourselves, and then how we can kind of understand the psyche of people who are kind of running contrary to that motion to have more of an ecological attunement. Like how might we understand them and then sort of bridge that gap? Does that make sense to everyone? Anyone have sort of initial thoughts on where to go?
Well, I just finished this book by Jeremy Lent. I was sharing a bit about my questions for him in the Discord earlier today, but it is about precisely this question, how to address the planetary emergency. And he's really focusing at the level of worldview intervention, coming in at the level of cultural change and a shift in values and all the things that like Marxists would refer to as the superstructure, right? That sort of the froth that floats on the surface that's determined by the material and economic conditions. And it left me wondering if ideas and values and worldviews are upstream or downstream of the place where the change needs to happen. In other words, if we intervene at the level of a critique of whatever consumer culture, or a critique of even critiquing capitalism and its psychologically and spiritually deadening and destructive effects, is that actually getting at the root causes of the planetary emergency? Or is it just easily, that type of critique, is it just easily swallowed up into the machine, as if it didn't even notice it wasn't, its progress wasn't impeded at all?
You would have to define the root causes immediately.
Yeah, and I think that's where worldview comes in, right, Chad? Yeah, I feel like it's almost like sort of a simultaneous dual motion. Right. It's like in a person's body, if you were to sort of say, okay, I want to actualize myself in a way that like grabs more of my creative potency, I wouldn't say that like I'm going to try to develop my mind at the expense of my body, or vice versa. Like,
yeah, you got to eat your Wheaties or you're not going to have exactly a clear mind.
Yeah, you can't eat your pudding if you don't have your meat.
Not that Wheaties are actually good brain food, but
yeah, I got
you. I mean, I just raised the issue of the material economic conditions and the culture and worldview level as a place to consider the multi-leveled the multiple levels of the issue that we're dealing with. And obviously I take the Marxist critique of capitalism very seriously, but I don't agree ultimately that consciousness and culture and all these things are just the froth on the surface. I think that there is an evolution of consciousness underway, and that it may take millennia, but ideas do have power to transform the world. Looking at history, it's pretty hard to deny that. Yeah. And someone who doesn't have enough food to eat isn't worried about self-actualization. So it's sort of a both and,
Yeah.
This is something I get into arguments about on a very regular basis in the leftist politics districts of Reddit, the base versus superstructure thing. And yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. The idea that material relations are kind of the bedrock, and everything else, religion and culture and the contents of our consciousness just kind of arising out of that base. I don't buy that. I think we could probably look at like Max Weber, Protestantism and whatnot. Look and Heidegger as well. The way that he sees the trajectory of Western metaphysics as something which is driven by its own internal dynamics, not just something that is a result of economic relations changing over time. Looking at history from that perspective, I think it does become very obvious. It's not just a matter of technologies being developed or political institutions changing such that the economic streams are diverted or converge in some way or another. There's more going on than that at kind of a metaphysical or ideological, at the level of the collective unconscious, right? That kind of thing that has to be taken into account. But with that said, it's like I do think there is room to be kind of pessimistic about the idea that we could just do what they tried to do in the 60s and just liberate our consciousness, and then we'll fix everything because everybody will be so damn woke that capitalism will just fall apart. It's much more likely that capitalism is just going to take anything, like even the big sweeping metaphysical ideas we talk about here, and just put it in a box and sell it, and that'll be the end of it. So there has to be an approach which takes both sides into account at the same time, I think.
Yeah. I've seen some of these post BLM, post Me Too, post COVID. I mean, we're still in COVID, but in the aftermath of at least this new reality beginning, that lockdowns and everything, I've seen some commercials that Coca-Cola has put out and other companies just putting on display everything we're all longing for, like just the connection with people. And that, of course, it's people who are of all different racial backgrounds and genders. And it's just the world that we want. And they're all drinking Coke. And part of me is like longing for the images that I'm seeing in that type of connection. And then this cynical part of me just feels like, oh, why is this the world that we live in, where like Coca-Cola is co-opting these very human desires that we have to sell a product that how have they not at least tried to like lower I mean, I know they have Diet Coke and whatever, but like they haven't even tried to go for like an organic, like kombucha style Coke or whatever. They just keep going with the same nasty product that gives people diabetes with this nice package on it. And they've been doing that for decades, right? Like,
they were doing
I think it gets back to the worldview and the money and it is the worldview of, profit and everything that does that. But Luke has a question.
Yeah.
So.
Willie, anything if you wrap it up just right, huh? Sorry, that was a secondary, I guess. Sort of a question with, I guess, an observation. I feel like maybe the thing that we're looking for in this need to almost reject this, I hesitate to say dualism, but anyway, this either harsh materialism or harsh idealism or whatever. We almost need like a rebellion, like a complete rejection of this commodification. And that has to happen within the individual before I feel like it can happen within the collective. Because I mean, we're both there's no really escaping that. We are both an individual and we are a member of whatever society, not to be sarcastic about it or anything, but there would have to be this open rebellion within each individual in order to reject this intense commodification that we are constantly being fed with, rather than, almost like Mike said, like consistent critique it would have to be an experience within ourselves as well, rather than just us critiquing what's going on. We must also act in a way that is very real and very effective to us internally, and I guess in a way that almost springs forth a desire in others.
Yeah.
I get, not to sound too wishy-washy or whatever, but there's something about, kind of going back to blue light jazz, there's something about watching somebody else enjoy something else and really being able to internalize that. And I think that maybe this is part of what we need. But what do y'all think? Yeah.
So, this actually reminds me of something that Foucault said, and Foucault often gets criticized by Marxists, or really just leftists in general, for being kind of sympathetic to neoliberalism. But what he says about liberalism is that it allows for the opening up of a kind of space such that new forms of life that are perhaps antithetical to capitalist liberalism are able to develop within the structure of capitalist liberalism itself, and thereby engender the possibility of new things coming about in the future. So maybe what we need to be looking at is less, tearing down the system as it is and trying to replace it whole cloth with something new, but more along the lines of just feeling our way forward so as to, figure out new ways of being in relation to each other and the environment and so forth, even while we are kind of under the boot, as it were, in the hopes that can then spread its tentacles outward and allow for something new to develop as things move forward. And it looks like things moving forward at this point means the climate apocalypse. So we better have some other ideas, once that comes about, right? So anyway.
No, I okay, gosh, there's so much that I like about this. I did like the whole sort of scheming face, like Mr. Burns or something. So ignore that part. But Luke, I think one of the things that you had hit on was this sort of interchange between, the individual and collective, and like this idea that it needs to kind of be this internal rebellion first, that then it sort of blossoms into collective rebellion by virtue of like people just sort of seeing the change. It's a very sort of like like religious idea of like seeing someone's inner transformation. It's like, oh, what's that about? And I do think that that's also like how like products and advertising work, right? It's like, we're like Matt was saying, we're watching images of a group of people on a screen having this grand old time, and like they're all drinking Coke. It's like, oh well, like Monkey Brain says, let's drink the Coke because I don't get the feeling, right? So that's part of it. So it's like kind of like hooking on to the kernel that is involved in like movements, whether they're sort of commercial movements or spiritual movements or whatever, and using that to spur change. What the thing that kind of what I was thinking about with regards to that was, I think I can't remember what the title of the essay was called, but it's at the end of Gary Snyder's collection of writing, Turtle Island. And he was like a poet from the San Francisco Renaissance, which was, like the predecessor to the 60s counterculture. And in it, he basically sort of like laid out, how to kind of get out of the mess as he saw it and other people had seen it coming in like the 70s or 60s. And it was this sort of multi-tiered process, like sort of system, where like you had transformation and you of both the mind and your practices at the local, personal, and then like sort of national / global level. And like it was all kind of needing to happen almost simultaneously in this like one big push that would inform and interchange each other. So like that's kind of like, speaks to what you were talking about of that dual movement. And I can't remember the other bit, so I will just sort of leave that for now, and maybe it'll come back to me.
Yeah. Well, it just seems to me, I mean, maybe I'm just in a bubble within a bubble here in the Bay Area, but culturally, so much progress has been made recently in terms of, you know, dealing with racism and dealing with sexual harassment, dealing with, you know, including gays and lesbians and transgender people. It's like the cultural front is moving forward in just the right way in terms of being more inclusive and compassionate and understanding of difference and so on. But I mean, the reason I brought up this Marxist critique is that beneath that, nothing much is changing. It's like we might get more diverse corporate boards, and maybe the 15 billionaires that don't have the wealth will be 15% Black and 10% gay and whatever. But is that really an improvement?
Yeah.
It seems that like neoliberal capitalism, kind of like you're saying, Keelan, is affording us more freedom at the level of culture than ever before. And yet it's all within the context of an economic system that's enriching ever fewer and that's continuing to rape the earth. And, you know, the clock is ticking in terms of how much longer we can continue that. I mean, we've already, the alarm clock's already going off. I mean, in so much of the world in terms of the blowback from Gaia for the way that our economy has been treating her. And so I just really feel this disconnect strongly, right, between the positive cultural changes and the way that that's being co-opted by the corporate world to sell their products. And then beneath that, you know, we still have a criminal justice system that has not been reformed. You know, we still have billions and billions of dollars subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. We still have factory farming, you know, the list goes on. And it's like this, you know, BLM and the protests that happened last year apparently were like the largest mass protest movement in world history. And it did raise consciousness, but has the criminal justice system changed? Have the millions of Black people in jail have their sentences reviewed? And, you know,
It's a little early. It's a little quick for that. Yeah. I mean,
am I just being impatient?
Maybe. I mean, I want to go back to what you initially started with. What was what's the author's name? Tim?
Jeremy Lent.
Jeremy Lent. That, like, so he's wanting to approach the meaning crisis at the level of worldview versus what you said.
This book.
Gotcha. The root causes, which I meant to say, like, you know, what are the root causes in his mind, and then relative to what the worldview is, that seems to me in my mind is what's rendering the problematic situation. You know, it's the mechanistic, disenchanted worldview upon which capitalism rests. That is the problem in my mind, right? So it's not like capitalism first, it's more like the worldview underlying it that's more at issue, that's more structurally, like, significant. I mean, does that make sense?
It does make sense. And you know, James Cameron can come up with an Avatar movie series that is a franchise that makes billions of dollars and everyone loves the worldview, but it's like packaged within the context of the same underlying economic model.
So this is why I feel so pessimistic about this. Zizek's got this joke he always tells, right? And it's about, like, I forget who it was. It's some like early 20th century physicist or whatever, and he's in some rural part of wherever the hell, Europe, and the guy does this superstitious thing where he puts, I don't know, something on his, like, door or whatever, and it's supposed to, like, ward off evil.
A horseshoe.
Whatever. And was that it? Yeah.
I think it's Niels Bohr. He put a horseshoe over his office.
I was thinking it was Niels Bohr, but I didn't want to say that and then be wrong about it. So cool. Anyway, so somebody asked him, like, do you actually believe that? And Bohr apparently is like, well, no, but I'm told that it works even if you don't believe in it. And it's like, capitalism's like that, I think, is the point Zizek's getting at. It works even if we don't believe in it. And in a weird way, sometimes it works better if we don't, because the anxieties we have about climate change and all the other injustices of the system. They have this kind of performative, cathartic outlet so that we can kind of feel like stuff's being done even when it's not. And the machine just can capitalize that and keep on rolling. And we feel like, oh, well, me and my woke buddies, realize that capitalism's evil. And so, something will eventually get done, right? But really, in a weird kind of way, it's perfectly fine from the perspective of capitalism that we don't support it ideologically. It just doesn't care. It's going to keep doing what it's doing anyway. And so, yeah,
kind of almost sounds like a new version of the opiate of the masses. That whole performative bitch you're talking about.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, we kind of sedate ourselves by thinking that we have some kind of say in the matter, when in a way we kind of don't. I don't want to be saying all this like I'm downplaying the importance of changing worldviews and whatnot. I think that is important, but my concern when taking those things into consideration is that we're still kind of left with a situation where we're waiting for things to fall apart so that we can hopefully have an opportunity to put the pieces back together,
So sorry. Someone else gonna. Okay.
You're good.
All right. So I guess a couple of things that I was thinking of. Yeah, I think there is kind of similar to like an opiate in the sense that Keelan, you kind of pointed out that these protests and these sort of collective like outbursts of anger or have this sort of like cathartic effect like after which, Matt, as you were pointing out, like the degree to which substantial systemic change happens seems to be disproportionate to the amount of collective outrage maybe. And that kind of brings back this idea, Luke, that you had of collective or individual and then collective rebellion providing a better way in this, let's say neoliberal marketplace of ideas. As I guess maybe this is sort of Marcuse's idea of the Great Negation, where you have like a band of sort of like smaller, disenfranchised, out on the margins people, just like not sort of not playing the game as much, and then building the intellectual / spiritual / practical scaffolding of a new way of being from that. But I guess my wonder then is, how does that get done? Like, what is the degree of sacrifice required of the individuals in that movement such that we really are like disconnected in a big enough way to shift the tide? And then part B of that question is that even necessary? Could it be accomplished through reform if we like sort of tackle one, sort of like get people like a group to tackle one issue, like minimum wage, and another group to tackle another issue like prison reform, and just have like a system of communities each tackling one issue and then sort of pool resources that way. So it's like it's really just sort of a question of mechanics or like methodology. Does that make sense? What are you guys
What do you
thinking?
think, Dominique?
Yeah.
Well, what I've been mulling over, and I guess to respond more directly to Raymond, is you seem to be talking about the practicality at the level of politics, at the level of system, at the level of
Praxis. Yeah.
practice, organization. And like what keeps coming back for me is Matt's original question of like, what is, I guess to rephrase it, was like, what is the grounding principle? Is it these mechanistic economic relations from which everything else arises? And it seems like we don't really have a grounding principle of value right now. And that, like, I want to connect that to like almost a collective pathology of narcissism. such that what narcissism is, from my understanding, is a lack of connection to one's kind of spontaneous life force, or kind of the core of one's being, such that one is always looking for oneself outwardly in the world to be mirrored. Like there hasn't been a genuine achievement of selfhood or internalization, which we can then perhaps connect to. Even we don't even really have a notion of internalization with the kind of worldview we have. So I'm wondering, I'm like throwing 5 things out at the same time, just unloading my thoughts, but I'm wondering if, as well as at the level of praxis, the practical how is also at the level of psychology,
Absolutely.
at the level of relatedness,
Yeah.
which doesn't happen that often. At least in my experience.
So maybe that's part of the difficulty with transforming outrage into effectual change, right? Is that you can't just be outraged.
You have to show it.
Yeah, because it's always outward.
Right. Because there needs to be like some kind of substantive valuative framework in order to be able to translate that into like a better world, you know what I mean? Because if all you've got is a sense of victimhood and injustice, you know, there has to be a flip side of that. And you know, again, I just spending a lot of time in leftist discussions. It you know, there's a lot of ambiguity as to what the values underlying that kind of political progressivism are even supposed to be. You know, you'd think there'd be more consensus on, well, no, you wouldn't, because leftists can't agree on anything, but that's an issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's maybe a surprising thing to hear from me, but as much as I dislike Steven Pinker's perspective, you know, that he's kind of the 21st century Pangloss, thinks we live in the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah.
He might not be totally. So what I disagree with him about is that clearly we need to do so much better. And there's a shadow side to all the industrial progress that we've made. It's not just progress. There's also tremendous destruction that's been unleashed. But, you know, speaking to this issue of resentment, Keelan, that you brought up, I feel like looking at the contemporary world in the West, let's say, the laws that are in place to protect people, despite the failure of the criminal justice system to fully, you know, live up to the spirit of the laws and the injustices that remain, I feel like in terms of the baseline of what people are willing to put up with, we're in a much better place than we've ever been in the whole history of the human species.
Yep.
And rather than this sort of anarchist rage to tear down the whole system because it sucks, it's like, well, it could be sucking a lot more, and it did suck. I mean, slavery was just taken for granted as required for civilization for thousands and thousands of years. We got rid of that. And I get that there's lots of hatred and that, you know, white supremacy is on the rise in the US and whatever, but I still think we need to shift the resentment and the fuck the system attitude towards, well, actually, we could work with this, and we need to turn our attention to self-governance and to take back the structures that have been co-opted by politicians that are bought and paid for, and like work within what we have, you know, instead of just trying to tear it all down.
I like that a lot, Matt. I feel like that this sort of thread has been kind of in a way touching on something that we had initially talked about, like, you know, 4 or 5 sessions ago, of like the relationship between Reconstruction and Deconstruction. And I think that there's an aspect of that, what you mentioned about, you know, the system being pretty good and like alleviating a lot of the suffering that had been there maybe 100, 200, 300 years ago over time, as part of the reason why most of us don't really feel as much of an immediate need to correct it, and that like a lot of these I guess a lot of these uprisings start with the people that are sort of like most marginalized by this, like, you know, well, most of us have pretty good, most of us have it pretty good, but some of us really, really don't. And so I guess, is it a question of looking to the commonalities between sort of marginalized social movements that have acted as correctives to the system that's been growing over the last couple hundred years, finding like the common worldview among those movements and then using that as a baseline for the reconstructed worldview? So it's like, that way it's not just outrage or like just a release of anger or tension, but that it's actively focused towards a worldview that we know will bind people together and create social change. Does that make sense?
So this is a place where I would just completely disagree with Foucault. And I think what Foucault says about this has kind of set the stage for a lot of really what you call identity politics, because he says that we don't need any kind of unifying set of substantive values or whatever in order to be able to be politically active. Instead, just, you know, everybody who's oppressed in some kind of way can kind of link their goals via the fact that they have common enemies and just work from there. So, you know, the queer community can, you know, link up with the Black Lives Matter community and with the whoever, and then the, you know, people in colonized parts of the world, you know, South America or what have you, and then we can just go from there without necessarily having any kind of common goal, really, even other than just resisting the power being imposed upon us. I completely disagree with that, because it's instead of a notion of the good or of justice, you have a justice shaped void that you're trying to work with instead. And I don't think that gets the same thing done. I think and that's not to say that there needs to be like one monolithic ideology that everybody has to accept. You know, there could be lots of different perspectives, but if there isn't an approach asymptotically from various directions on some kind of common idea of what society should actually look like, as opposed to just what we don't like about it now, I think that's a recipe for disaster. If you don't,
I think we talked about the Foucault-Chomsky debate in maybe our first session, right?
Yeah, we did.
Yep.
Foucault wouldn't even admit that there's some sort of human nature, like, you know, the desire to love and be loved, and like he wouldn't even accept anything vague. It's just no such thing. It's totally a construct of power. And where does that leave us?
Everything he says with more than a grain of salt.
Yeah.
I really like what you said, Dominique, and like about a value system. I think that's what you're also pointing towards, Keelan, is like, if there's no intrinsic good or value that we agree upon prior, or something, that you're constructing it through your desire and stuff, and to get the collective different groups to agree on that would be very, very difficult. Like I really appreciate what you're saying, Dominique, and like, again, I'm gonna posit the astrological perspective, because it does seem to provide a framework or a template upon which that we can recognize value internally and connect that sense of value connected to the transcendent, to the archetypes. And yeah, did you want to say something, Matt?
Well, just to amplify your point, I mean, I think of something Terence McKenna used to talk about, that to change civilization, we need a new calendar, which is to say a new relationship to time. And I see astrology as in some way relating to the cycles of the planets in a conscious way that like actually structured our day-to-day civilizational activities, would put us back in touch with this larger source of
absolutely. I mean,
meaning.
What it does is it provides a qualitative insight, or insight into the quality of time, not just quantity. Yeah. It actually opens up to an aesthetic window into the actual quality of experience and phenomena internally and externally. And that's where go ahead, Tommy.
I was going to say one thing that like I realized the other day was like what astrology does is that it provides both like a universal grounding and a personal myth. So it has that universal pluralism to it that like I think might be something that desirable.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Where like I'm quite hesitant to like, oh, we want a common collective value upon which we all assent to or espouse, and then therefore it acts as a flattening like device.
I agree. I feel that same. I have that same skepticism, and I've always had that about any singular perspective coming, it intrinsically has the potential to become dogmatic very easily,
and yet mythically and scientifically, it's hard to deny that the sun and the moon are our parents, that we all share this common origin in this evolutionary story. And you can tell that story scientifically, or you can offer any variety of different mythic versions of it. But the notion of kinship, I think, is pretty universal, but it still leaves and needs to leave room for a diversity of expressions at the level of different cultures and each unique individual. But I think we can have both.
Yeah, which it does that. It's fascinating about archetypes themselves, because they are, undefinable patterns, but yet they create definable, they allow us to define things at the same time. They give order, they give structure. So it's this paradox, but but the point I'm trying to raise is that because they're undefinable and inexhaustible, I think it becomes hard. It's difficult for it to become dogmatic. You see what I'm saying? Because it at the top end is flexible, not rigid. It's open-ended, the archetypes themselves. And so you see what I'm saying? It's not actually participatory as to how the phenomena, everything is expressed.
I think the only way it could become dogmatic is if there's a priesthood of initiates who has the definitive interpretation of a transit or a planetary archetype or whatever.
And that's not the case.
Right. It needs to be a system, a knowledge system, and a system of practice that's fully distributed. Then each person feels that they have the authority to make an interpretation, and the knowledge needs to be democratized. In other words,
exactly.
There's no priesthood of astrologers that gets to decide.
And I think it has that. Please go ahead. But I think it has that innate. It's how we come to recognize it, and in our discourse, how we discuss it together as to coming to an understanding of what's happening. Not any one individual is going to be able to see it all.
Dominique, I think you were.
Well, I had a bit of a question that arose, and I'm wondering on you guys' perspectives on it. Where like I feel in myself a tension between the part of me that wants to take the kind of archetypal patterns, if you will, as both inexhaustible and providing a like a universal belonging of humanity, such that, like, for example, the god Pan illuminates one aspect of sexuality that might be more traditionally demonized.
Literally.
But there's also another part of me that feels a pull towards at least like a arc towards a sense of hierarchy or towards a sense of metamorphosis or refinement, such that like I feel quite drawn towards virtue ethics, or kind of the sense of there are nobler parts of oneself as well as baser parts of oneself, and to integrate the baser parts of myself with the nobler parts means to kind of limit and transform both the whole and the more unruly destructive part. So there's this kind of pull toward one sense. Part of me kind of likes a hierarchy, one sense, and part of me sees the danger of hierarchy. And I wonder how you guys parse that or think about that.
Yeah. So, oh gosh. All right. So, see if I can try to kind of combine what you said, Dominique, with what Chad was saying, because I feel like they are operating on sort of the same level of like threading the needle between dogma, structure, and hierarchy on the one hand, and sort of sort of diversity and play and flexibility on the other hand. And it's like I kind of like want to just sort of say that, oh, it's like sort of a dynamic tension of opposites, but like what does, like, how that actually instantiates itself in like reality, I'm not really sure. One thing I did want to say to about this though is that like there does seem to be something about archetypal images and like sort of Jung's notion of the collective unconscious that is like less about enforcing a dogmatic or enforcing doctrine through dogma, and more about something more revelatory, in the sense of like doing this sort of unveiling movement of the things that are sort of like lying in this common unconscious space between everyone, that everyone sort of like latch onto in their own way. So going back to what you were saying, Matt, about like sort of cultural expression. And so maybe that would sort of like avoid part of the need for dogma, in that like as long as you can kind of find your way towards the archetypes and the sort of the common for lack of a better word, like eternal truths that are available to everyone. It doesn't need to sort of have this sort of imposed order from outside, as long as like you're sort of like doing that revelatory practice, maybe through ritual. I guess the only other thing I was thinking about is how that system, that balance of unity and diversity, or like revealed truth and then particular expression, gets translated to people who can't really sort of stomach the packaging or the language, or the esoteric aspects, or just because not if we're trying to get everyone involved here, not just, a particular subset of humanity. And so like, is it the case that the sort of the ability to access revealed truth is like what, like, it's like, what are like the mechanisms for common, I hate to use that word, but like the average person to be able to really like have this sink in? I mean, is that the work of myth? It would seem to be, but like, then what is that myth? Does that congeal? And you guys kind of see what I'm saying?
So
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're worried about the skeptics, the rationalists, the people who have no patience for astrology, and like, how do we get them on board? Is that?
It's in addition to that, it's just like, let's say on average, like someone who's like working a 9-to-5 accountant job in like Fresno is going to be consuming as much as many resources on a daily basis, maybe more, maybe less, as you or myself and whatever. Like, yes, there needs to be mindset change. Yes, there needs to be practical aspects of that as well, and they feed each other, of course, because we are what we believe. I grant that, and there is this sort of inner psychological work that also needs to be done. Yes, and I do think that because it's unconscious, that the archetypal realm can serve as a sort of a common seed ground for those changes, because everyone can access them in their own way. I'm just wondering, in addition to the rationalists and the skeptics, just like just man on the street, like, what's their connection? How does that myth relate to as many people as it would need to relate to? Like, how does
you got to keep in mind the average person on the streets probably also go into some, Southern Baptist church on Sundays or what have you, or going to watch Marvel movies and, internalizing whatever the hell archetype Captain America represents, So yeah, we're consciously, probably mostly unconscious.
Yeah.
What was that,
Dom? What was that?
The archetype of a really nice butt.
Yes,
America's
butt. That's the one.
That's the archetype.
Yeah, the platonic form of it, if you will.
Yeah, there we go.
Dominique's channeling Pan over there.
What's interesting about the astrological perspective is that it just requires your birthday, and everyone has a birthday. And you see what I'm saying? Like, it actually, like, there's a universality to astrology that I can't think of anything else that has that. It's across the planet,
Who doesn't want to hear how they, as an individual, fit into the cosmic context?
So actually, this is what
I want to address something like on a bigger picture level, like, because it seems like what we're really started with was the worldview, right? So it's like, like the Copernican revolution is what instantiated our current modern worldview, that combination with mechanistic science, right? And so, like, how many people are actually have fully grokked that the Earth goes around the sun? Supposedly not all that, it's like half or some shit, so like what we're talking about is like, how many people can move into our new worldview, and half the people haven't grokked the previous one. So like, but capitalism and science has, and they've structured our worldview through their actions. So like, because we went to the moon with rockets and we can shoot bombs and all this, it works, it's convincing, and it does, like what you were saying, Luke, it has that internalized revolutionary capacity, which through mimesis we get, and that's why we sink into the worldview. So like, on some level, it is going to take like this revolution of people participating and demonstrating the benefits of the worldview that we're describing, like, or ultimately describing how astrology can help us, but it really does seem like it gets down to that level of what we believe is the nature of reality and our place in it. And I kind of am curious what you started with, Matt, with like does Jeremy have an idea of how to approach that with, as far as worldview, attack area, approaching it on that level?
I mean, the subtitle of his book is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And so he's really looking at, he turns to the East to actually Taoism and Neo-Confucian philosophy, which, is so rich in sort of tapping this creative vein that runs through all things, and making each individual feel like they're okay just as they are, and it's this sort of go with the flow attitude, and don't try too hard because you might, put a kink in the hose of the Tao or whatever. And it's, it's a great philosophy, and I certainly resonate with it. But my issue with Jeremy's book, and he and I can talk about this. We're doing an event in a couple of weeks together, but he's a little too harsh, I think, in attacking the West, in attacking Plato, and attacking Christianity because of the dualism and the sin, and the soul is all that matters, and it goes to heaven, and the body can just rot, doesn't matter, right?
Mhm.
And I get that's there's a dominant interpretation that many people have that is exactly that. But I think there's just as much depth in the sort of esoteric streams of the West as there is in the East. And a lot of the key insights are strikingly resonant with one another, arrived at, independently on different continents. And you look at the axial revolution in India, Israel, Greece, China, like these thinkers are all emerging, having this insight in one way or another into transcendence.
Right.
And so, I would take a slightly different approach to Jeremy, just because for people living in Europe and the US and South America now, anywhere influenced by Christianity, Africa too, I mean, it's spread everywhere. Christianity, Islam, like these are the dominant world religions. And the question is, can we, it almost seems to me that Jeremy is saying we need to chuck all that and just start fresh. And like these Neo-Confucians, they got it. Let's import that everywhere. It's like,
Right.
I think we need to work with the archetypes that are already rooted in each unique culture, which thankfully the wisdom traditions all the world around have similar insights and
That
value.
seems to me tantamount to just like throwing away the entire collective unconscious of a culture and just trying to adopt another one, right? Like that seems a little like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, not to mention just being like very impractical.
Right. We have to work with what we have, and the astrology is an interesting case of a practice and an art, a way of seeing the cosmos that is also transcultural. Every culture has its own form of astrology, and there are thankfully resonances among the different archetypal qualities that are assigned to planets and signs and so on. And so I think there's a real opportunity to sort of build on, maybe not in America, because I was thinking of the encyclical from Pope Francis that really has, it hasn't even fully caught on within the Catholic Church, because there's a lot of conservative Catholics that are like, this guy's a commie, we need to get him out of there, which is weird because, he's the Pope. If you're a Catholic, you're supposed to listen to your Pope. But a lot of these conservative bishops, you can see how they're already so secular that they don't even believe their own religion anymore when it comes down to it.
Yeah, it's a
But
culture.
with Pope Francis has taken the Catholic Church in, I think, a really positive direction. Huge shadow in that institution. I don't really know if they can recover from the pedophilia thing, but what do we do about the Baptists? What do we do about evangelical Christianity in the United States? How can we use the symbols and the myths and the values of evangelical Christianity to transform people into more compassionate, ecologically minded, social justice oriented people. I think there's actually a real potential there that's pretty much untapped, because most liberals would rather just shame them and, you know, tell them they're stupid or whatever.
And then we get Trump.
I think it's very salient that that the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s was led by a Baptist preacher in a large part. And I think, that is a big sort of aspect of maybe what we're talking about is, again, sort of finding the commonalities, like doing the sort of like the many to the one movement, right? And then grabbing that and sort of like refracting it through all the existing structures that we have, so that, like, you know, the like you were talking about, the diversity of systems, the diversity of worldviews, can just kind of like do their work, and almost like they've been sort of like hijacked by a virus. But in this case, the virus is that kernel of perennial eternal truth that lies dormant within each one of those worldviews, but this just hasn't really been fully revealed because of all the chaff that's accumulated over time due to power struggles and things like that. Does that kind of make sense? Like, Luke, I think you had your...
Yeah, makes sense.
I'm going to try and show a little bit of charity to, you know, the Baptists and all the very Protestant people to you know, we want to get on board with this and everything, and that you're right, just kind of being swept under the rug by a lot of the left, and even, you know, some of the right, as well as everything moves forward, the kind of left in the past. I think that the desire is there. You know, growing up, I've been in both very small Protestant churches with very little diverse representation, and I've also been in very diverse Protestant churches, and the diverse ones are accepting, as far as, you know, it's obviously not perfect. You know, they do hold a lot of very fundamental views that aren't right necessarily, but I think there's more progress there. And I think a lot of the negative aspects of different, you know, smaller sects of Southern Baptists and all of that sort of thing, I think a lot of it's there because there's just not a lot of diversity in those areas. And I think it'd be kind of uncharitable to not point that out. That, you know, you can't have diversity if the literal entire city is 90% white. It's just not going to really be there, you know. But if you get into bigger cities, even in smaller communities of these Protestant churches and everything, there's still more diversity involved, you know, and there's more acceptance and there's more understanding and there's more awareness of these social issues, even if their idea of fixing the social issue may not necessarily be cohesive.
So it's like just the practical act of trying to weave together a community with greater diversity kind of forces more open, more pluralistic perspectives on community, right? Which then kind of
I would say
feeds
that's
in,
absolutely true,
right?
for sure.
Well, while I got the
Typically-
mic, two
Go
things.
ahead.
So one, super quick, is we were talking about the way that archetypal astrology and things like that kind of weave us into some bigger cosmic picture. I've been listening to a lot of Robert Moore over the past few days while meditating, and by meditating I actually mean playing Minecraft. But anyway, he talks a lot about that need for self-significance and how it's oftentimes pathologized. And of course, he wants to kind of swing things in the other direction, like, no, this is actually a fundamental human need for a sense of meaning and significance and whatnot. And so maybe that's a place where we get to a fork in the road. There's you can go the direction of my significance is the power that I have over other people, or feeling more competent than them in some kind of way, or even like a victimhood complex that kind of singles you out as special in some kind of way and gives you some kind of self-anchoring. And then the other way, which would be the non-pathological way, is that you weave yourself into some bigger narrative such that there's something beyond yourself, of course, that gives you meaning, but whether it be like some kind of like environmentalist activism, or some kind of moral substantive good that you feel like is inside of you but will also outlive you and is in other people, such that your own ego is not the center of the damn universe. Second thing I wanted to bring up is just a little quick question for Chad, and you might not even have the answer to this, but I'll go ahead and throw it out there. Is have you done any comparing of like Indian and Chinese astrology to Western astrology? Do you know anything about the ways in which they might converge or diverge?
A little bit with the Vedic system, not so much with the Chinese. I really know very little about their system. But what with the Vedic system, they don't use the outer planets. So they stop with Saturn, the last visible planet. And so their astrology is more fatalistic. It's more deterministic, similar to the way astrology was prior to the Copernican revolution. It was more kind of fate, like, you were at the will of the gods and you're at mercy of the gods. And you could do treatises and, try and move yourself in a little bit of alignment with them. But after the Copernican revolution and the individuation process and the forging of the modern Western identity, we see ourselves as autonomous with agency and in this process of psychological development. And it's that the Western astrological perspective integrates that. It's kind of placed on it. It's like where we're moving into relationship with the gods and goddesses with our volition, rather than being at the will, the mercy of them. Like, because the Vedic system, it's like you'll be married on this day. They even predict your death and stuff like that. And there's a lot more intrinsic free will in the Western system. But
one more comment and I'll shut up. But I was just going to say that fatalism does seem to jive more with Hinduism, more broadly speaking. The way that they consider the self, the Atman, to be just completely insignificant, with that kind of, the idea of personal freedom seems like it would be less important to them to then incorporate that into their astrological system as well.
Right.
Okay, I'm done.
What's interesting about everything we've been talking about and what Jeremy is pointing towards, and like what McGilchrist points out and what Robert Bella points out as well, is that in the axial transformations in the East, they didn't develop like formal logic. Like they get the holism and they get the individual and the collective, but like formal logic like doesn't really come in. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis it's not like a huge part of the Eastern traditions. And like what McGilchrist points out is that like he's thinking that it's the West, there's something different about the Western brain that's more left hemisphere dominant. And he goes into really deep analysis of this through like how we developed language and the written word, and like it's pictograms in the East, and it's much more right hemisphere. It's more visual, and like the phonetic, whatever the language,
Phoenician,
the alphabet.
The alphabet,
Phoenician alphabet, yeah.
Phonic, or they have different descriptions of the two Indo-Europeans, Slavic and
Phoenician.
Maybe it is Phoenician.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, yeah, Phoenician. And sorry, I'm not familiar with it.
No, you're good.
What he points out is that like the right hemisphere is where language begins, writing it down, but then it switches to the left. And like the left hemisphere is what's now dominant with language and communication, but it actually emerged in the right. And like in ancient Greece, they used to write from right to left. And then it switched in the 7th century, 6th, 8th century. It did box or ox bow. It went back and forth like a ox would row, and then it changed to left to right when the left hemisphere became more dominant. And it actually is around the time of Plato that in ancient Greece, when the left hemisphere becomes dominant, and then it is the left hemisphere that did the division, the parts of the being and becoming that we're still trying to overcome, that division, where it didn't really happen in the East, and I think that's what Jeremy is kind of pointing towards, is that, and McGilchrist says similar, is like it's through the body and the soul, and art is through the right hemisphere, and that's our way back through it. But he also says that through aligning ourselves with more Eastern modalities is helpful as well. But he indicates, before they get colonized by the West, which is happening, like the Eastern mindset is already becoming very Westernized. So like, but I think there's something important about the West. I mean, it's my own arrogance or self-centeredness or something, but the separation, the recognition of the good and the differentiation that allowed for the individuation process that we're talking about of the Western identity, that was an important process for the forging of who we are. But we have to make this connection back to the right hemisphere, to holism, to the whole, or else we're not going to make it. Like it's schizophrenia and is a left hemisphere problem. Like it's right hemisphere deficit. And you can see in a certain way that we've cut ourselves off from the meaning, and it's created a schizophrenic mindset. And McGilchrist says that schizophrenia doesn't even emerge until the 1800s. So, but he also says that Descartes is one of the potentially first like kind of schizophrenic people, because he sees the world as mechanistic, right away. And that's the parts. And I don't know, sorry, I'm tangenting and maybe not making a lot of sense, but
no, I'm glad you're bringing McGilchrist into this, and the difference between maybe phonetic was the word you're looking for, phonetic
language
phonetic versus
that's right,
like ideographic or character-based languages.
Yes, he points out, I don't know the clarity, but like even when vowels come in, it shifts, moving towards left to right hemisphere or something. But go ahead.
There's definitely, the evolution of consciousness has been totally tied into the development of different language systems, no question about it. It's shaped the brain, and I do think there's something to this East-West difference, though. I have to say, though, the Vedic traditions using Sanskrit with it, which is phonetic, they, in terms of the development of logic and grammatical analysis, even dualistic systems like Samkhya, like the Indian philosophers were very good at doing all of that stuff, but they had a phonetic language, so it still fits. It's just, this complicates the East-West division. It's like, it's not that simple, and yet it can't be dismissed either. There's clearly something going on there.
I was thinking maybe this has something to do with the law of identity, right? Because for logic, you need A equals A. And then in a lot of Hindu thinking, A is not A is Brahman, right? So maybe that fits into it somehow. But anyway, that's all I said.
Yeah, I guess just to kind of piggyback on what Matt was saying, is that like Hinduism is kind of like Talmudic in some way, in that there is like the sort of initial more like ritual and Vedic tradition, like that constitutes the orthodoxy, and then from that you have like this wide-ranging discourse with a bunch of like varying opinions and interpretations and schools of thought as to like what the relationship between Brahman and Atman is, and like how karma works, how rigid caste is, and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot more wiggliness and fluidity going on in that whole school that can't be sort of captured in a like as a monolith. And to that end, I feel like you were saying, there is a lot of, or similarly in terms of like the fluidity and the diversity within Hinduism, and the degree to which it had a facility with like dialectic and syllogistic logic. I feel like the bleed through between East and West in terms of how those schools, through trade and interchange, and sort of mutual development, really constitute one motion, in much the same way that left and right brain might not be so discrete. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Luke? You had your hand raised as well, but
I think there's a lot of overlap. And yeah, I don't know if that answers it very well.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Luke.
Sorry. I guess my question is what implications that would have for like Arabic languages. I want to kind of tie it back to what you said in the beginning, how we started out kind of reading left to right, and then we kind of started boxing it, and then we started reading, right to left the whole way. But Arabic languages never changed like that, to my understanding anyway. And that to me is an interesting point. And I don't know if it's something that's even really worth fleshing out, but I find that very, very intriguing that it was like you said, almost exclusively Western languages that made that switch. And then, we still have Farsi, Arabic, the different dialects of Arabic that all read from left to right.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't remember I don't have the answer, and I don't know if he tries to answer it per se. I know he mentions Arabic. I don't remember what he says about it, but what he is saying, and I don't know when Arabic was formed either, because part of it is there is an evolutionary process, and he's talking about these changes, I think, basically prior to ancient Greece. And then, and like by ancient Greece, it's written from left to right. And what the idea is that that language it emerges in the right hemisphere, which is more symbolic and sees and meaning and stuff. But the left hemisphere is what breaks things down into parts. And there's something about the development of language that it's just parts, like alphabet or whatever is just parts. And so it requires the left hemisphere more than it does the right hemisphere, because if we were using pictograms or whatever, the right hemisphere would be more engaged. And so the idea is that even in Chinese, they use the left hemisphere, even though it has more pictures today, because I don't know, we're evolving, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how he addresses that.
Almost like the way it's broken into grammatic structure is what utilizes more of the left hemisphere rather than the fact that it's a language. Does that make sense?
I think so. So. But we have to read the book together, you guys. He says that Hegel, Hegel's philosophy, is an articulation of the dialectic between the left and right hemispheres. He has a whole passage where he reads Hegel, and then he'll just say left hemisphere, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. And
I've been meaning to read McGilchrist's book for so long, since it came out. Really, everyone was talking about it back then, and now his second book is coming out, and I feel an increased sense of urgency because I want to read. I think it's 2 volumes that's coming out, and they're 700 pages each.
Wow, I didn't realize how much. Yeah, that's I mentioned it on the occult thread, I think, or maybe the Plato thread. I'm not sure, but we should read it together. It was an idea. I think we should read it together, and over the before November, when the next book comes out.
No, I know you guys on the East Coast are getting pretty sleepy, so maybe we should wrap this session of Friends of Wisdom up. Glad we solved it all.
As usual.
People watching took notes and can implement all of the advice that was on offer here.
Wait, this was advice?
Yeah, we're consultants.
Yeah, obviously.
Matt's officially changed his name to PCC Program to show how authoritative he is.
Whoops, we're have to change that. Nothing I say is the opinion of the philosophy program or CIS.
Again, and end with that disclaimer. Okay. I think.
All right.
All right. Much love, you guys.
Yep. Like
Later.